Hey everyone, if you've ever had your boss pull you aside after months of grinding for a company deal and deliver that one final ice-cold warning that makes your stomach drop because you realize the team was never real, then you already know the kind of sickening betrayal I'm about to unpack. My name is Claire Montgomery. I am 30 years old, and for the last 6 years I poured everything I had into building compliance systems for a mid-sized investment firm that operated out of this sprawling luxury desert campus in Rancho Mirage, California. The place looked like something out of a magazine palm-lined pathways sleek glass conference pavilions, even a private golf course for client schmoozing. But underneath all that polished desert glamour, the pressure was always boiling just below the surface. What happened there last year still feels like it happened yesterday. The kind of chaotic unraveling that leaves you questioning every late night, every extra report, every time you trusted the wrong people. Before I get into how my boss turned what should have been my biggest professional win into a complete nightmare, I want to ask you something real quick. Have you ever watched someone you thought had your back suddenly treat you like you were disposable? The second their own scheme started to crack. Drop a comment below if you have, because knowing I'm not alone in this mess helped me get through it. Hit like if you've ever had to choose peace over loyalty that was never mutual. It was a brutally hot afternoon in late August when everything started to fracture. I was standing in the main conference pavilion, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the manicured cactus gardens and the distant mountains. We were closing a massive client portfolio review for one of our biggest institutional investors, the kind of deal that could have locked in my promotion to senior compliance director. I had spent weeks stress testing every share allocation, every ownership transfer, every hidden clause in the partnership agreements. My slides were flawless. My numbers were airtight. But halfway through my presentation, the room started to tilt. My vision blurred at the edges, my heart hammered like it was trying to escape my chest, and I had to grip the edge of the podium just to stay upright. The words kept coming out of my mouth on autopilot, but inside, I was spiraling. Months of 80-hour weeks, skipped meals, and constant last-minute demands from upstairs had finally caught up. I finished the final slide, forced a professional smile, and the clients clapped politely. Then my boss, Garrett Harlan, stood up at the head of the long mahogany table, his expensive watch catching the sunlight streaming through the glass. He thanked the clients, dismissed the rest of the team with a nod, and turned that sharp, practiced smile on me. "Claire," a word he said, voice low, but carrying that edge I had learned to recognize. Everyone else filed out, including my coworker Lucas Vaughn, who shot me a quick, unreadable glance before disappearing down the corridor. Once the heavy glass doors clicked shut, Garrett's expression hardened. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't acknowledge the fact that I had just nearly passed out in front of major clients. Instead, he leaned forward, palms flat on the table, and delivered the devastating last warning that still echoes in my head. "Listen to me very carefully, Claire. This is your final chance to fall in line. The board is looking at restructuring equity packages across the executive tier, and I need your signature on the share adjustment documents today. Lucas and I have already aligned the numbers. It's a simple formality that protects the firm's flexibility. Refuse and I'll have no choice but to reassign you to the compliance back office permanently. No more client-facing work. No more path to director. Your call." His tone was calm, almost bored, like he was discussing the weather instead of threatening to bury 6 years of my career. I stood there, still catching my breath from the presentation, and tried to process what he was really asking. These weren't minor adjustments. These were my own vested shares in the firm shares I had earned through performance bonuses and sweat equity over years of building the very systems that kept the company clean. I had always kept meticulous records, quietly protecting my small stake because I believed in the work. Now Garrett was demanding I sign them over in a way that funneled control straight to him and Lucas. I asked him, voice steadier than I felt, why this sudden rush on a Friday afternoon at the campus when the full board wasn't even present. He laughed short and sharp, the sound bouncing off the glass walls. "Don't play naive. Lucas has been handling the operational side beautifully. You've seen the reports. The firm needs liquidity for the next round of acquisitions, and your shares are the cleanest path. Sign, and we all move forward. Refuse, and you become the problem we have to manage. That was when the chaos really started to hit me. The unstable, off-balance feeling that everything I thought I knew about this place was shifting under my feet. I excused myself, claiming I needed water, and walked out into the shaded courtyard where the desert heat pressed in like a living thing. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and opened the internal share registry I had access to as compliance lead. What I saw made my stomach twist harder. Several of my vested equity lines had already been flagged for reallocation in the system dated 2 weeks earlier, before today's presentation, before any official board discussion. Lucas's digital signature was right there next to Garrett's. I stood under one of the palm trees, the dry wind whipping my hair, and tried to steady my breathing. This wasn't just pressure. This was coordinated. My coworker Lucas, the guy who had sat across from me in strategy sessions for years, the one who always joked about us being the only sane ones in the building, had been helping my boss quietly chip away at my position. And the worst part, I had trusted them both. Later that evening, back in one of the sleek on-campus guest suites the firm kept for late-night closings, I sat at the glass desk overlooking the illuminated pool and started digging deeper. I pulled up old emails, archived board minutes, anything that might explain why my shares were suddenly on the chopping block. That's when I remembered something Evelyn Hart, our longtime senior mentor, and the woman who had quietly guided me through my first 2 years here, had told me years ago over coffee in this very campus cafe. She had advised me to set up a protective transfer for my equity stake right after a messy internal audit scandal that nearly tanked the firm. I had followed her advice and moved my shares into an irrevocable trust structure I controlled as trustee. The assets hadn't actually vanished in the usual sense. They were legally shielded, locked away from any sudden corporate maneuvers. But Garrett and Lucas didn't know that. Or at least they weren't supposed to. The next morning, the campus felt different, heavier. I ran into Sophie Whitaker in the executive lounge. Sophie had been one of my closest allies here, the one who always had my back during tough compliance reviews. She gave me a quick hug, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, Claire. Heard things got intense yesterday with Garrett. You okay?" Her voice was gentle, but I caught the hesitation the way she glanced toward the hallway, like she was already calculating her next move. When I started to explain the share demand, she cut me off softly. "Look, I don't want to get in the middle of this. Garrett's been talking to the whole team about keeping things streamlined for the acquisition push. Maybe just sign what they need and keep your head down." Her words landed like a quiet betrayal. Sophie, who had once stayed late with me to flag questionable transactions, was already pulling away. The social circle I thought I had built here was starting to fracture one careful step at a time. I spent the rest of that day in my temporary office door closed quietly compiling everything. By late afternoon, I had a folder full of timestamps showing Lucas had accessed my equity files multiple times without reason. I printed copies of the old trust documents I still kept in my secure drive, the ones that proved my shares couldn't be touched without my explicit trustee approval. But I didn't confront anyone yet. I needed to understand how deep this went. That evening, Garrett called me back into the main pavilion. Lucas was already there, leaning against the table, with that easy grin he always wore right before delivering bad news. The desert sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the room in oranges and reds that felt too dramatic for the conversation. Garrett slid a fresh stack of documents across the table. "Last chance, Claire. Sign these share adjustment forms tonight, or I start the formal performance review process tomorrow. You've been under a lot of stress lately. Wouldn't want that to affect your standing here." Lucas nodded along, adding, "We're all in this together. Just make it easy on everyone." The room felt like it was closing in the unstable pressure of their combined expectations, making my pulse race again. I stared at the papers, my mind spinning through every late night, every sacrificed weekend, every time I had covered for their shortcuts. I took the pen they offered, but instead of signing, I simply set it down. I need 24 hours to review these properly, I said, keeping my voice even though everything inside me felt like it was unraveling. Garrett's eyes narrowed, but he gave a tight nod. 24 hours. After that, we handle it my way. I left the pavilion with the unsigned documents in my briefcase and the distinct feeling that the ground under my feet at this entire desert campus was about to give way. Little did I know that the real proof of their manipulation was already sitting in my possession, legal papers that had been accidentally left behind in a shared drive weeks earlier, and an undelivered confession letter that would change everything once I found it. But that discovery was still one chaotic, heart-pounding day away. The next morning, the desert sun hit the compound with its usual intensity, turning the palm-lined pathways into shimmering heat waves that made the whole place feel even more unstable than it already was. I barely slept in the guest suite, my mind replaying my boss's words over and over like a broken record. By the time I made it to my temporary office in the compliance wing, the air conditioning was blasting, but it did nothing to cool the unease churning in my stomach. I locked the door, booted up my laptop, and started going through the share adjustment documents my boss had given me the night before. That's when the first piece of the puzzle fell into place in a way I never expected. While cross-referencing the files in the shared company drive, I noticed a folder my coworker had access to that wasn't properly secured. Inside were several legal papers that looked like they had been accidentally left there, drafts of share transfer agreements with my name highlighted and annotations in my coworker's handwriting about rerouting my vested equity into a management pool controlled by my boss. But the real shocker was a scanned copy of an old memo referencing an irrevocable trust I had set up years ago on Evelyn Hart's advice. The assets hadn't vanished in the sense of being lost. They had been legally shielded long ago, moved out of direct company reach to protect against exactly this kind of internal maneuvering. My boss and my coworker clearly didn't know the full extent, or they wouldn't be pushing so hard. My hands shook as I copied everything to my encrypted drive. But that wasn't the only discovery. Buried in an archived email thread from 2 years back that I had forgotten about was an undelivered confession letter from Evelyn Hart herself. She had drafted it, but never sent it to HR or the board. In it, she detailed how my boss had been quietly manipulating business shares across the compliance team to consolidate power, using my coworker as his right hand to access restricted files. She expressed guilt for not speaking up sooner because she feared for her own position, but the letter laid out timestamps and specific instances of unauthorized access. It was like finding a time capsule of the betrayal that had been brewing right under my nose. I sat back in my chair, the chaotic swirl of emotions making the room feel like it was spinning. Sophie Whitaker walked by my door later that morning, and I waved her in. She looked uncomfortable from the start. "Claire, I heard things are getting tense with the restructuring," she said, avoiding my eyes. When I tried to show her some of the discrepancies, she stepped back. "I can't get involved. My boss made it clear the team needs to stay united right now. You understand, right?" Her words felt like another crack in the foundation I thought was solid. Old allies pulling away one by one, the social circle at the compound shrinking around me as people chose self-preservation. That afternoon, my boss called another closed-door meeting in the glass pavilion. My coworker was there again, looking too casual for the tension in the air. My boss slid more papers across the table. "Time's almost up, Claire. Sign or the performance review starts tomorrow, and you know how those can go in this environment." His voice had that unstable edge, like he was barely holding back frustration. My coworker chimed in. We're just trying to keep the firm strong. Your shares are key to that liquidity." I stayed composed on the outside, observing every micro-expression, every nervous glance between them. But inside, everything felt like it was coming apart at the seams. I told them I was still reviewing and would have an answer by the end of the day. As I left the meeting, the desert wind outside seemed to carry whispers of the coming storm. Little did they know, I had the evidence now: the accidentally left papers, the undelivered letter, and the realization that my protected shares meant their whole scheme was built on sand. Later that evening, Rebecca Klein from HR stopped me in the corridor near the executive lounge. She had always been friendly during compliance trainings, but now her smile was tight. "Claire, just a heads up. Your boss asked me to pull some files on recent equity adjustments. Tyler Grant mentioned seeing some unusual activity too, but he's keeping his head down. I'd be careful if I were you." Her quick glance over her shoulder told me the social circle was abandoning ship faster than I realized. Even the people who once had my back were choosing sides, and the unstable pressure of it all made the entire compound feel like it was tilting beneath my feet. I spent the rest of the night in the suite piecing everything together, my mind racing through the implications of that undelivered letter and those carelessly left legal papers. The past was catching up in the most chaotic way possible, and yet a quiet resolve was hardening inside me. I wasn't going to sign. I wasn't going to let them rewrite my 6 years of work into their personal power grab. But I also wasn't ready to blow everything open just yet. I needed one more piece to make sure the trap would close completely around them. The all-hands team meeting was scheduled for the next afternoon to celebrate the restructuring. I knew that was when my boss planned to make it public and force my hand in front of everyone. The question was whether I would let the scheme play out a little longer or step in and turn the chaos against them. The unstable energy at the compound was reaching a breaking point, and I could feel my own quiet empowerment solidifying right in the middle of it all. The next afternoon, the all-hands team meeting kicked off in the main glass pavilion, the desert sun pouring through the windows and turning the room into a pressure cooker of unstable energy. Everyone was gathered: colleagues I had worked alongside for years, the clients who had been at my presentation, even a few board observers. My boss stood at the front with that practiced smile, my coworker Lucas Vaughn right beside him, flipping through a tablet like this was just another routine update. The air felt thick, the kind of chaotic tension that made the palm fronds outside sway a little too violently in the wind. I took my seat near the back briefcase on my lap, observing every nervous glance and forced smile around me. My boss cleared his throat and launched into his pitch voice, booming through the microphones. "Team, today marks a new chapter for us here at the compound. With the restructuring finalized, we're aligning equity to fuel the next wave of growth. Liquidity is key, and that means some adjustments across the board. Claire, why don't you come up and walk us through your share contribution? It's the perfect example of putting the firm first." His eyes locked on mine, that devastating last warning from 2 days ago, still hanging between us like a live wire. The room shifted uncomfortably. A few people whispered, but no one spoke up. I stood slowly, my steps measured across the polished floor, the chaotic heat of the desert pressing against the glass walls. I didn't go to the podium. Instead, I set my briefcase on the nearest table, opened it, and pulled out the folder I had prepared. "Actually, before we talk about contributions," I said, voice calm, "and even let's talk about what's really been happening with those shares. Because the documents you left in the shared drive accidentally tell a much clearer story than any presentation could." I held up the first page, the legal papers my coworker had carelessly left accessible weeks earlier, complete with his annotations about rerouting my vested equity straight into a management pool he and my boss controlled. Gasps rippled through the room. My boss's smile faltered for the first time. Lucas shifted on his feet, that easy grin slipping into something tighter. "Claire, this is not the time or place," my boss started, but I kept going, quietly, empowered by the truth. I had pieced together. I laid out the next sheet timestamps showing unauthorized access to my files, and then I read aloud from Evelyn Hart's undelivered confession letter, the one she had drafted, but never sent, the one that detailed exactly how my boss had been manipulating business shares across the compliance team for months, using Lucas as his inside man to chip away at anyone who stood in the way. The words hung in the air raw, and specific naming dates, file paths, even the small bonuses Lucas had received for facilitating the changes. The room went dead silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning fighting the desert heat outside. Sophie Whitaker, who had pulled away from me just days earlier, stared at the papers with wide eyes. She glanced at my boss, then back at me, and slowly shook her head. Garrett. Lucas. I thought this was just standard procedure. I didn't know. Her voice cracked, and she took a step back toward the group of colleagues, the social circle fracturing right there in real time. Rebecca Klein from HR crossed her arms, her earlier tight smile gone. Tyler Grant, the senior analyst, who had once joked with me in the lounge, muttered something to the person next to him and looked away from the front of the room. Old allies were pulling away, but this time they were abandoning my boss and my coworker instead of me. My boss tried to recover, stepping forward with that unstable edge in his voice. This is completely out of context. Claire has been under enormous stress. We all have. These documents are internal drafts, nothing more. But Lucas was already sweating under the bright lights, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The chaotic energy in the pavilion was spiraling whispers, turning into outright murmurs. I stayed composed, observing the way their carefully built facade was crumbling. The shares you're trying to manipulate didn't vanish because of poor performance or restructuring. They vanished long ago, legally transferred into an irrevocable trust I set up years ago on Evelyn's quiet advice. You can't touch them. You never could. That's why the adjustments never went through in the system the way you planned. I slid the trust deed across the table so the whole room could see the notary stamps and the clear language naming me as sole trustee. The ironic twist hit them like the desert wind kicking up sand outside. My boss's face drained of color as he realized the liquidity they had been chasing. The power grab they had orchestrated had been built on shares that had been protected and out of reach the entire time. Lucas let out a short, disbelieving laugh that sounded more like panic. You knew he snapped at my boss. All those late nights, all the access I gave you, and you didn't even check if the assets were still movable? The two of them started turning on each other in low, frantic voices right there in front of everyone, the unstable alliance they had built fracturing under the weight of their own greed. That's when Evelyn Hart herself stood up from the back row. She had been sitting quietly the whole time, the mentor I had trusted since my first year on the compound. Her voice was steady, but carried across the pavilion. I left those papers in the shared drive on purpose, Claire. I drafted the confession letter 2 years ago when I saw the pattern starting. I never sent it because I was afraid for my own position, but I made sure you would find it when the time came. You've always been the one who did things the right way. I couldn't let them erase that. Her quiet role revealed in that moment, Evelyn had been the silent guardian all along, protecting me from the shadows while the chaos unfolded. The room erupted in stunned reactions. Colleagues who had been wavering now looked at my boss and Lucas with open disbelief. Marcus Hale, the company counsel who had been observing from the side, cleared his throat and stepped forward. Given what's been presented, I'm recommending we pause all equity adjustments pending a full internal review. This looks like it crosses into regulatory territory. Carla Ruiz, another senior analyst I had collaborated with on compliance projects, nodded firmly from her seat. I'm with Claire on this. The numbers never added up, and now we know why. Nathan Brooks, one of our key institutional clients, stood and excused himself quietly, already pulling out his phone, clearly the kind of exposure no one wanted attached to their portfolio. The social circle that had once orbited my boss and Lucas was abandoning them completely, the desert compound's polished image cracking open in real time. My boss tried one last desperate play voice, rising in that chaotic, unstable way I had come to recognize as the mask slipping. This is a misunderstanding. We were protecting the firm. But the damage was done. The board observers were already exchanging looks, and HR was taking notes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply closed my briefcase, looked my boss straight in the eye, and said, "I resign effective immediately, and I'll be taking every record of this with me to the regulators if anyone tries to spin it differently." The meeting dissolved into disarray as people filed out, some stopping to offer quiet words of support, others simply walking away in silence. My boss and Lucas were left standing at the front, the weight of the exposure settling over them like the relentless desert sun. I walked out of the pavilion into the warm evening air, the mountains in the distance steady and unchanging. For the first time in months, the chaotic pressure inside my chest eased into something quieter, resilient, steady victory without a shred of guilt. In the weeks that followed, I packed up my things from the guest suite and left the compound for good. No dramatic scenes, no final confrontations. I simply chose peace daily the way Evelyn had quietly modeled for me years earlier. The past caught up exactly as it needed to, and no contact with any of it brought the kind of freedom I hadn't realized I was missing. I started my own small compliance consulting practice from a quiet office overlooking a different stretch of desert, working with clients who valued integrity over shortcuts. The social circle I once thought defined me at the firm faded into memory, replaced by real professional relationships built on trust. My boss and Lucas faced the consequences quietly in the background. Internal investigations lost client confidence, the kind of slow professional isolation that karma delivers when the social circle abandons you completely. I heard through distant channels that the restructuring they had pushed so hard for collapsed under scrutiny, an ironic twist that left their own shares diluted and their influence evaporated. I felt nothing but quiet relief. The childhood-like bonds of loyalty I had once felt toward the firm, toward the people I thought were my team, were severed cleanly. No more unstable demands, no more hidden manipulations. Just freedom. Thank you for listening to my story. It took me 30 years to learn that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Have you set boundaries with someone in your life who crossed every line? I'd love to hear how you found your own quiet victory in the comments below.